Some children are afraid of the dark. They see monsters in the spaces beneath their beds, in the deep, quiet corners of their closets. But in the year 1866, in a small, forgotten town tucked away in the dense forests of New England, there was a little girl who was different. She wasn't afraid of the dark. She was afraid of the light. Because it was in the light, she said, that the shadows had to hide. And when they hid, they couldn't tell her their secrets. This is the story of Elara Vance, the girl they called the Whispering Child. It's a story of a town so choked by its own secrets that it couldn't see the real darkness gathering at its edges. And it's the story of what happened when that little girl, the only one who listened to the shadows, simply vanished. What she left behind was a silence louder than any scream, and a mystery that would stretch and warp the very fabric of reality for everyone who knew her name. What do you think the shadows told her? By the end of the story, you might be afraid to even guess. The town of Havenwood Hollow was built on a foundation of silence. It was a place carved out of the unforgiving wilderness, a small pocket of civilization where God was feared, neighbors were watched, and the past was a thing best left buried. The year was 1866. The Civil War had ended, leaving scars on the nation and on the men who had returned to the town. But in Havenwood Hollow, the deepest wounds were the ones no one ever spoke of. The town's lifeblood was timber and stone. Its heart was the austere white church on the hill, and its currency was reputation. A good name was worth more than gold. A bad one was the sentence. Into this rigid, quiet world, Elara Vance was born. She was the only child of Thomas Vance, the town blacksmith, a man whose strength was known by the ringing of his hammer and the set of his jaw. Her mother had passed in a fever when Elara was just a toddler, leaving the gruff, solitary blacksmith to raise a daughter who was nothing like him. Where Thomas was solid and loud, a creature of fire and iron, Elara was ethereal and silent, a creature of whispers and twilight. From a young age, she was different. She didn't play with the other children. Their games of tag and hide-and-seek seemed pointless to her. Instead, she would sit for hours under the great oak tree in the town square, her head tilted, her gaze fixed, not on the tree itself, but on the complex, shifting patterns its shadow cast upon the ground. She would trace the edges of the darkness with a small, pale finger, a faint smile on her lips, as if she were reading a story only she could see. The townsfolk noticed. Of course they noticed. In a place like Havenwood Hollow, every deviation from the norm was catalogued and discussed in hushed tones over picket fences and in the pews after Sunday service. At first, they called her peculiar. Thomas Vance's strange little bird, Mrs. Gable, the postmistress and the town's primary source of gossip, would say, "Never peep out of her, just watching." But as Elara grew, peculiar soured into unsettling. It began with small things. One sweltering afternoon, she approached old Mr. Abernathy as he sat on his porch, fanning himself. She was perhaps 6 years old. She stood before him, her eyes wide and serious, and whispered, "The shadow of the weather vane told me you buried your wife's silver locket under the loose floorboard in the pantry. It said she's sad you look for it in the wrong place." Mr. Abernathy went pale. His wife had died 10 years prior, and the locket, a cherished heirloom, had vanished. He'd torn his house apart looking for it. That evening, a floorboard in his pantry was pried up, and a small, tarnished silver locket was found nestled in the dirt below. He never spoke of it, but the story spread like a virus through the town's nervous system. How could she have known? This was the nature of Elara's whispers. They were never malicious, not exactly. They were just true. She told the baker's wife where her husband had really been on his late-night deliveries. She told a farmer that the shadow of his scarecrow remembered where he'd lost his father's wedding band in the field a decade ago. She told a young woman, weeping by the river, that the secret she carried wouldn't be a secret for much longer. Each revelation was a small tear in the carefully woven fabric of Havenwood Hollow's public face. Her father, Thomas, was at a loss. He loved his daughter with a fierce, desperate love, but he also feared her. He would come home from the forge, his hands and face smudged with soot, and find her sitting in the darkest corner of their small cottage, her eyes tracking the movement of the dying light across the floor. "What are you doing, Elara?" he'd ask, his voice rough with exhaustion and anxiety. "The shadow from the chair is telling me about the man who made it," she might reply, her voice as soft as dust. His name was Samuel, and he was lonely. He put a piece of his loneliness in the wood. Thomas would just sigh and alight the lamps, flooding the room with a warm, steady glow, trying to chase away the very things his daughter sought out. He tried to get her to go to school, but she would sit by the window, ignoring the lessons, watching the shadow of the flagpole inch its way across the schoolyard. The other children, a mixture of fearful and cruel, called her Shadow Mouth. They'd throw pebbles at her, chanting rhymes, but she never seemed to notice. Her world was not their world. Her companions were silent, formless, and everywhere. The town's anxiety was given a voice by one man, Reverend Miller. He was a fire and brimstone preacher, a man who saw the devil's work in a poor harvest or a child's fever. In Elara Vance, he saw something far more insidious. He saw a conduit for darkness. From his pulpit, he began to speak of unnatural curiosities and whispers from unholy sources. He never used her name, but everyone knew who he was talking about. He warned his congregation that some secrets were meant to be kept, buried by God for the good of man, and that to unearth them was to invite chaos. The tension in Havenwood Hollow began to climb. People started pulling their curtains tighter at dusk. A friendly nod on the street was replaced with a suspicious, sidelong glance. The secrets Elara had unearthed, small as they were, had planted seeds of distrust. The baker and his wife now argued in public. The young woman by the river was eventually sent away to live with a sick aunt in another county. The farmer who found his ring now looked at his neighbors with narrowed eyes, wondering who else knew his business. Elara wasn't just speaking to shadows. She was holding up a mirror to the town, and they did not like the reflection. Then came the autumn of 1866. The air grew crisp. The leaves turned to flame and then to rust, and a palpable sense of foreboding settled over the hollow. The shadows grew longer with each passing day, stretching their dark fingers across the landscape. Elara, now 9 years old, became even more withdrawn, more attached to the growing twilight. She spent less time in the town square and more time at the edge of the woods that bordered their property, a vast, ancient forest that the townsfolk regarded with a primal respect and fear. One evening, as the sun bled out behind the western hills, Thomas found her standing at the tree line, her back to him. She was staring into the deep, impenetrable blackness of the woods. "Elara, come inside. Supper's ready," he called, his voice tight. She didn't turn. "They're different in there, Papa," she whispered, her voice carrying on the chilly air. "What's different?" "The shadows. They're older. They have deeper secrets." A shiver, cold and sharp, went down Thomas Vance's spine. He strode over, took her small, cool hand, and led her back to the flickering warmth of their cottage, locking the door firmly behind them. He didn't know what he was locking out or what he was locking in. The final week of October was heavy with the smell of wood smoke and damp earth. A storm was brewing, not just in the bruised purple clouds gathering on the horizon, but in the heart of the town. The breaking point came during the annual Harvest Festival. It was supposed to be a time of celebration, of giving thanks for the bounty of the land. But this year, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken resentment. Elara was there, a small, silent figure standing near her father's stall, where he was selling iron tools and trivets. She wasn't watching the festivities. She was watching Mayor Thompson, a portly, self-important man who was giving a grand speech about community and integrity. Her eyes were fixed on the long, distorted shadow he cast in the light of the setting sun. After the speech, as the mayor was accepting congratulations, Elara slipped through the crowd. She walked right up to him, tugged on the sleeve of his fine wool coat, and when he looked down, she whispered something in his ear. No one heard what she said, but they all saw the result. Mayor Thompson's face, flushed with pride and cider, went slack. The color drained from it, leaving a pasty, sickly gray. He stared at the little girl, his mouth agape, his eyes wide with a terror so profound it silenced the entire square. He stumbled backward, knocking over a table of pies, and then without a word he turned and fled to his home, locking the door behind him. He wouldn't be seen again for 3 days. The town was electric. The question was on everyone's lips. What did she tell him? The speculation was wild and venomous. The shadows, it seemed, had finally shared a secret too big to ignore. That night, a meeting was held in the church. Thomas Vance was not invited. Voices were raised. The Reverend Miller's words about unholy influence were repeated, no longer as a warning, but as a diagnosis. The girl was a problem. Something had to be done. The next morning, on October 29, 1866, Thomas Vance woke to a silent house. Elara's bed was empty. It was neatly made, which was not unusual for her. But the small, worn coat she always wore was gone from its peg by the door, and her little boots were missing. He called her name, his voice echoing in the small cottage. He searched the yard, the forge, the path to the woods. Nothing. He ran into town, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. He burst into the general store, his eyes wild. "Have you seen Elara?" he asked, his voice cracking. The storekeeper just shook his head, refusing to meet his gaze. It was the same everywhere he went. Shaking heads, downcast eyes, a wall of silence. By noon, the news was all over Havenwood Hollow. Elara Vance was gone. Some whispered she had finally run off to join her dark companions in the woods. Others, their faces grim, suggested her father, finally driven mad by her strangeness, had done something terrible. A few, the most fearful, believed she had been taken, not by a person, but by the very shadows she so loved to speak with. As the day wore on, a strange, unnatural twilight seemed to fall over the town, even though the sun was still high in the sky. It was as if the world itself was holding its breath. And then people started to notice it. The shadows, they seemed different. The shadow of the church steeple looked sharper, more pointed, like a dagger aimed at the heart of the town. The shadows in the alleyways between buildings seemed deeper, blacker. The shadows beneath the ancient trees at the edge of the forest seemed to writhe and pulse as if they were alive. She claimed the shadows told her secrets. Now she was gone, and in her absence, the shadows of Havenwood Hollow began to grow longer. The disappearance of a child should have united the town. It should have sparked a frantic, collective effort, a desperate race against time. But in Havenwood Hollow, the vanishing of Elara Vance did the opposite. It fractured them. The seeds of distrust she had sown with her whispers had taken root, and now, in her absence, they began to sprout into thorny vines of paranoia and accusation. Sheriff Brody was the first to realize this wasn't going to be a normal search. He was a practical man, a veteran of the war who had seen enough real-world horror to have no time for ghost stories. He believed in evidence, in motive, in the simple, often brutal logic of human action. When Thomas Vance, his face a mask of grief and panic, had formally reported Elara missing, Sheriff Brody had assured him they would find her. He'd thought it was a simple case of a child wandering too far, lost in the woods. He was wrong. His first step was to organize a search party. But when he went to the tavern to round up able-bodied men, he was met with a strange reluctance. Men who would normally jump at the chance for some drama or to be seen as helpful suddenly found reasons to be busy. Their fences needed mending. Their livestock needed tending. Their eyes shifted away from his, focusing on their mugs of ale as if they held the answers to the universe. "She's just a little girl," Brody had insisted, his voice tight with frustration. "She's more than that, Sheriff," one man finally muttered from the corner, not looking up. "And you know it." He eventually cobbled together a small, grudging group. As they set out towards the woods bordering the Vance property, the atmosphere was funereal. No one spoke. The only sounds were the crunching of leaves under their boots and the rustle of the wind, which seemed to whisper unintelligible words through the skeletal branches of the autumn trees. The woods themselves felt different, hostile. The searchers stayed close together, casting nervous glances into the deep pools of darkness between the ancient oaks and pines. Every shadow seemed to hold a shape. Every snap of a twig sounded like a footstep behind them. They found nothing. No footprints, no shred of torn clothing, no sign that Elara had ever set foot past the tree line. It was as if the forest had simply swallowed her whole. Sheriff Brody turned his attention back to the town, to the people. He started with the last person to have a significant, public interaction with Elara, Mayor Thompson. Brody found the mayor in his study, a decanter of brandy nearly empty at his elbow. The man was a wreck. His hands trembled, his eyes were bloodshot and darting. "Mayor, I need you to tell me what the girl said to you at the festival," Brody said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Thompson flinched, splashing brandy onto his desk. "It was nothing. A child's nonsense. It was enough to make you run and hide for 3 days. It was enough to make this whole town curdle. Now you tell me what she said." The mayor stared into his glass for a long moment before he spoke, his voice barely a whisper. She said the shadow of the old millstone knows what happened to my brother." Brody frowned. "Your brother? I thought he died in the war, a hero." "That's the story," Thompson choked out, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on his cheek. "That's the official story. He never went to war. We had a fight about the inheritance, the mill. It was a long time ago. There was an accident out by the old quarry. No one ever knew. No one could have known." He looked up at Brody, his eyes hollow with a terror that was more than just fear of the law. "How could she know, Sheriff, that little girl?" She looked at me, and it was like she was looking right through my skin, at the rotten thing I've kept hidden in my soul for 20 years. The sheriff left the mayor's house with a cold knot in his stomach. This wasn't a case of a lost child anymore. This was something else entirely. Elara wasn't just unearthing secrets. She was unearthing graves. The secret she'd whispered to the mayor was the first of the town's great foundational lies to be cracked open. And it was just the beginning. Brody's investigation continued, but it felt less like a search for a missing person and more like an excavation of the town's collective guilt. He spoke to the baker's wife, who, after much prodding, admitted that Elara had whispered to her that the burn mark on her husband's arm wasn't from the oven, but from a branding iron on a stolen cow from the next county over. He spoke to the farmer who'd found his wedding band, who confessed that Elara had also mentioned that the scarecrow's shadow remembered him, moving the boundary stone on his neighbor's property by 10 feet one moonless night. Every conversation was the same. A whispered secret, a hidden sin, a life built on a lie. Elara had been the town's confessor, but she hadn't offered absolution. She had only offered knowledge, and that knowledge was now a poison seeping through the community. The search parties officially disbanded after 3 days. No one wanted to find Elara anymore. They were terrified of what other secrets she might tell if she was brought back. It was better, they reasoned, in their silent, fearful hearts, if she just stayed gone. Only Thomas Vance continued to search. Every day, from sunup to sundown, he walked the perimeter of the woods, his face etched with a grief so raw it was difficult to look at. He called her name until his voice was a hoarse rasp. The town watched him, a solitary, tragic figure, and they felt a mixture of pity and relief. He was paying the price, they thought, for bringing such a strange creature into their world. The atmosphere in Havenwood Hollow grew darker. The unnatural twilight that had fallen on the day of Elara's disappearance seemed to linger. The shadows, once a simple consequence of light and object, had taken on a new significance. People started avoiding them. They'd walk in the middle of the street to avoid the long shadows cast by the buildings. They'd light their homes brightly from the moment the sun began to set, burning through expensive oil and candles, desperate to keep the darkness at bay. Mrs. Gable, the postmistress, claimed the shadow in her back garden had started to look like a tall, thin man, always watching her window. The stable boy swore the shadows in the hayloft moved and rearranged themselves when he wasn't looking directly at them. These stories, once dismissed as foolish superstition, were now listened to with grim, knowing nods. The shadows were no longer empty. Elara was gone, but her presence, her influence, was stronger than ever. The one person who seemed to thrive in this new, fearful climate was Reverend Miller. His Sunday sermons became the town's main event. The church was packed, with people standing in the aisles, their faces upturned and desperate for answers. The Reverend gave them an answer they could understand. "The Lord works to keep some truths in darkness, for they are too heavy for mortal souls to bear," he thundered from the pulpit, his voice echoing in the rafters. "But a vessel was made amongst us, a child who communed not with angels, but with the empty, godless spaces in between. She pried open the locks on our secret hearts, and in doing so, she unleashed a pestilence of suspicion. The shadows have grown long because we have allowed sin to fester in the dark. Her disappearance is not a tragedy, it is an asterisk warning asterisk. A final chance to purge the wickedness from our midst and turn back to the light." His words were a balm for their terrified souls. He gave them a narrative. Elara wasn't a victim. She was a catalyst, a witch, a trial sent by God. The town's growing madness wasn't their fault. It was a righteous purge. And every town, in the midst of a purge, needs a scapegoat. Their attention turned to the one person who didn't fit, the one person who had always lived on the fringes, quietly observing, Arthur Finch. He was a recluse who lived in a dusty, book-filled cabin on the far side of the hollow. He was a man of learning, a collector of local folklore and history, things the practical, God-fearing people of Havenwood Hollow had little time for. They'd always seen him as an odd but harmless eccentric. Now they saw him differently. He dealt in old stories, in whispers, in things best left forgotten. He was, they reasoned, the same kind of different as Elara. Sheriff Brody, hitting dead end after dead end, decided to pay Mr. Finch a visit himself, not out of suspicion, but out of desperation. He needed a new perspective, and he knew Finch's knowledge of the region's history was unparalleled. He found Finch in his cabin, surrounded by teetering stacks of books and strange hand-drawn maps of the area. The old man's eyes were sharp and intelligent behind his spectacles. "Sheriff," Finch said, not sounding surprised, "I was wondering when you'd come. You're looking for a lost girl, but you found a nest of vipers instead, haven't you?" Brody sighed, running a hand over his tired face. "I don't know what I found. I found secrets, lies. A town ready to eat itself alive, but no sign of the girl, no ransom note, no body, no witnesses. It's like she just evaporated." Finch gestured for the sheriff to sit. "She didn't evaporate, Sheriff. She became significant. There are old stories about this land, pre-colonial stories, tales of what the native tribes called the echoing places. Spots where the veil between what is and what is seen is thin. They believed that certain people, what we might call sensitives, could hear the echoes of things that had happened there. Not ghosts precisely, more like stains on the world, emotional residue, a great secret, a great crime, a great sorrow. They all leave a mark, a kind of shadow on reality." Brody stared at him. "You think Elara, was hearing these echoes?" "I think she was reading them," Finch corrected gently. "This town, Sheriff, is built on a great many secrets. The land deal that founded it was fraudulent. The first pastor was a charlatan who ran from the law. There was a smallpox outbreak in the early days that was deliberately covered up to avoid a quarantine. These are not just historical footnotes. They are wounds. They leave scars. Scars leave shadows. And that little girl, she could read them like a book." Finch stood up and walked to a dusty bookshelf. He pulled down a heavy, leather-bound tome. "People often dismiss these things, Sheriff. They're like those modern penny dreadfuls, or that tale from West Virginia people are starting to talk about. What is it they call it? Asterisk, the unsettling case of the Greenbrier ghost asterisk. They treat it as entertainment, but they fail to see the pattern. The world remembers. It holds on to things. Elara wasn't speaking to the dark. She was listening to the world's memory." The sheriff felt a headache coming on. This was far beyond the scope of a simple lawman. "So what does that mean? Where is she?" Arthur Finch's face grew grim. "That is the terrible question. If she was simply a conduit for these old secrets, her disappearance is a mystery. But what if she was more? What if, in her unique state, she uncovered a secret that wasn't old? A secret that was new and raw and still had a person attached to it, who was willing to do anything, absolutely anything, to keep it buried?" The implication hung in the dusty air of the cabin, heavy and cold. Elara hadn't just been whispering about the past. She may have stumbled upon a secret of the present, and for that someone may have decided to silence her permanently. The search wasn't for a lost girl anymore. It was for a witness, or a victim. Sheriff Brody left the cabin with a new, terrifying theory. Elara Vance hadn't been taken by shadows. She'd been taken by a monster who walked in the light. The first snow of the season fell a week after Elara's disappearance, blanketing Havenwood Hollow in a pristine, deceptive layer of white. It covered the dead leaves and the muddy tracks, hiding the town's decay under a veneer of purity. But it couldn't hide the fear. The fear was a living thing, a cold that seeped into homes not from the winter air, but from the hearts of the people themselves. Sheriff Brody's new theory that Elara had been silenced was a grim and logical path to follow, but it presented an impossible problem. The list of potential suspects was essentially the entire town. Who hadn't Elara unsettled? Who didn't have a secret she might have glimpsed in the flicker of a shadow? The mayor, the baker, the farmer. They all had motives, however small. He was searching for a killer in a town full of liars. The town, meanwhile, guided by the fiery sermons of Reverend Miller, had found its own suspect, Arthur Finch. The old recluse, with his books and his strange talk of echoes and shadows, was the perfect target for the displaced terror. He was the outsider, the one who didn't conform. A delegation, led by the Reverend himself, marched to the sheriff's office. "A man Finch is a student of the dark arts," Miller declared, his face flushed with righteous fury. "He has filled the child's head with his profane folklore. He is the root of this corruption. You must arrest him." Brody held up a hand, his patience worn thin. "On what charge, Reverend? Owning books? Being old? I have no evidence linking Arthur Finch to anything." "Evidence?" A man in the crowd scoffed. "The evidence is all around us. The very air in this town has soured since that girl started her whispering. Finch is the only one who didn't seem scared of it. He encouraged it." The sheriff knew it was a fool's errand, but to appease the growing mob mentality, he agreed to question Finch again. This time he brought a deputy. When they arrived at the cabin, however, they found the door splintered, hanging off one hinge. Inside, the place was a wreck. Books were torn from shelves, their pages ripped and scattered like confetti. Maps were shredded. Years of research and quiet scholarship had been destroyed in a fit of panicked rage. Of Arthur Finch, there was no sign. A second person had now vanished from Havenwood Hollow. This second disappearance sent a new shockwave through the town. But it wasn't one of fear. It was one of grim satisfaction. To them, Finch's flight was an admission of guilt. He had taken the girl, and now, with the law closing in, he had fled. The case, in their minds, was closed. They could begin the process of forgetting, of burying this ugly chapter and returning to their quiet, orderly lives. But Sheriff Brody didn't believe it. The scene at the cabin wasn't the work of a man packing in a hurry. It was an act of violation, of intentional destruction. Someone had been looking for something, and they hadn't wanted Finch to be able to talk about it. He began to meticulously sift through the wreckage of the cabin, his deputy complaining about the dust and the futility of it all. For hours, Brody found nothing but ruined paper. Then, tucked inside a large, overturned atlas, he found a small, leather-bound journal that had been missed by the vandals. It was Arthur Finch's private log. The script was cramped and spidery, but as Brody sat in the dim, violated cabin and began to read, a new, more terrifying picture of Elara Vance and Havenwood Hollow began to emerge. Finch hadn't just been a passive collector of folklore. He had been studying Elara. Asterisk. October 12th, asterisk, one entry read. "The Vance girl approached me today. I did not seek her out. She stood by the stream and watched my shadow on the water. She told me my shadow was sad because it remembered my wife. It's been 30 years since Eleanor passed." How? Asterisk. October 18th. "She is not a medium. She is not possessed. I believe she is something else entirely. She perceives a dimension of reality we are blind to. The past is not gone. It is simply a resonance, an echo. This place, Havenwood Hollow, is a sounding board for these echoes due to the foundational traumas. She is the first I have ever encountered who can hear the music clearly." Brody flipped through the pages. Much of it was esoteric, academic, but then the entries from the final days before Elara's disappearance took on a new, urgent tone. Asterisk. October 26th. "She came to me again. She was agitated. She said the shadows were getting louder. She spoke of a new shadow, a fresh one. Not an echo from the past, but something recent. A shadow that was still screaming. It was near the old quarry," she said. "The place where the town gets its stone. The old quarry." The same place Mayor Thompson had mentioned in his terrified confession about his brother. Brody felt a jolt, a connection. Asterisk. October 27. I have warned her. I told her some doors should not be opened. Some echoes are tied to people who are still alive, people who will do anything to ensure they remain echoes. She did not seem to understand the danger. She is driven by an innocent, terrifying curiosity. She speaks of the man with the shadow of two faces. A chilling description. Is it metaphorical? Or is she seeing something literal, an auric stain? Asterisk. October 28th, the day of the festival. She found me this morning. She was pale, her eyes wide. She said she knew what the screaming shadow was. She said, the stones remember him. They remember the fall, and they remember the shovel. She was determined to tell someone. I begged her to tell me first, to let me handle it, but she just looked at me and said, the shadows want everyone to know. It's only fair. I fear I have failed her. I have treated her as a fascinating phenomenon, not as a vulnerable child in a town of wolves. This was the final entry. The next page was blank. Brody sat back, the journal in his hands. The man with the shadow of two faces. The stones remember the fall. The shovel. This wasn't about the mayor's long-dead brother. This was something new. A fresh murder. A body hidden in the quarry. This was the secret Elara had whispered to Mayor Thompson. Not about his brother from 20 years ago, but about a new body in the same place. She hadn't just exposed his old sin. She had, in her innocent way, accused him of a new one, or at least of knowing about it. His terror wasn't just from a ghost of the past. It was from the immediate, terrifying threat of a fresh investigation. Suddenly, the pieces began to slam into place with sickening clarity. The town's hysteria, Reverend Miller's sermons whipping it into a frenzy. It was all a perfect smokescreen. While the whole town was looking for a witch or a ghost, a very real human monster was covering his tracks. Who benefited the most from the town descending into chaos and blaming a reclusive old man? The person with the most to hide. Brody's mind raced. The quarry was on the edge of town, mostly abandoned now except for when a farmer needed stone for a new wall. It was vast, remote, and filled with 100 years of rubble and dark, water-filled pits. A perfect place to hide a body. He had to move quickly, but he also had to be smart. He couldn't trust his own deputy, who was a local boy, related to half the town and a firm believer in the Finch did it theory. He was on his own. That night, under the sliver of a crescent moon, Sheriff Brody left the town, a shovel and a lantern in his saddlebag, and rode for the old quarry. The place was a gaping wound in the earth, a chaotic landscape of jagged cliffs and deep shadows. The moonlight did little to penetrate the darkness, casting strange, monstrous shapes that shifted with the clouds. Brody lit his lantern, the small circle of light feeling woefully inadequate against the oppressive blackness. He thought of Elara's words from Finch's journal, asterisk, the stones remember. He didn't know where to start. The quarry was immense. He walked the perimeter, the lantern light skittering over piles of loose rock and debris. He was about to give up, to write it off as the ramblings of a scared child and an eccentric old man when he saw it. Near the western edge, where a large rock slide had occurred years ago, the ground looked disturbed. It was subtle, something no one would notice unless they were looking for it. The pattern of the rocks was wrong. Some of the larger stones were fresher, their undersides not yet weathered by the elements. He set down the lantern and began to dig. The work was brutal. The ground was a stubborn mixture of dirt and sharp-edged shale. His hands were raw within minutes, but he was driven by a cold certainty, the grim conviction of a man who knows he is on the verge of a terrible truth. After an hour of back-breaking labor, his shovel struck something that wasn't a rock. It made a dull, soft thud. He knelt, scraping away the dirt with his bare hands. First, he uncovered a piece of rough-spun cloth, then a button, and then a human hand, pale and still in the lantern light. He worked faster now, his breath misting in the frigid air. He uncovered a face, frozen in a silent scream, the eyes staring blankly at the dark sky above. It was a man he didn't recognize, clearly not from Havenwood Hollow, a traveler perhaps, a peddler, someone no one would miss. But as he continued to clear the shallow grave, he found a second body buried beneath the first. This one he recognized. The face was bloated and bruised, but there was no mistaking the spectacles, the shock of white hair, the tweed jacket. It was Arthur Finch. The killer hadn't just made Finch disappear. He had buried him here, in the very place Finch had been investigating. Brody felt a wave of nausea and fury. Finch had known he was in danger. He had tried to protect Elara, and he had paid the ultimate price. But where was Elara? There was no sign of a child's body in the grave. As he stood there, staring down at the grisly tableau, the final, most horrific piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The vandals at Finch's cabin, they weren't just looking for his research. They were looking for his journal. The journal Brody now held. The killer knew Finch had been talking to Elara, that he was likely the only other person who knew what she had discovered. The killer had gone to the cabin to retrieve that evidence. This meant the killer was someone who knew Finch, someone who knew he kept records, someone with a vested interest in the town's affairs, someone who could move about without suspicion, who could stir up a mob to create a diversion, who could commit murder and then stand in a church pew and preach about sin. The man with the shadow of two faces, a public face of piety and a private face of monstrous evil, Reverend Miller. The Reverend had been the loudest voice condemning Elara, the first to call her a witch. He had expertly redirected the town's fear, first towards the girl, then towards Finch. It was the perfect misdirection. While the town was hunting for a supernatural evil, Miller was burying the evidence of a very human one. But what was the original crime? Who was the first man in the grave, and why had Miller killed him? And the most chilling question of all still remained. If Arthur Finch was in this grave, silence forever. What had the Reverend done with the little girl who spoke to shadows? The answer that formed in Sheriff Brody's mind was so dark, so unthinkable. It made the cold night air feel like a furnace. He hadn't just silenced her. He had to have used her. Her disappearance was the key. It was the event that allowed him to seize control of the town's narrative, to paint himself as their savior from the darkness he himself had created. Brody carefully covered the grave, marking the spot. He had the evidence he needed. He had the journal, and he had the bodies. Now he had to go back into the town of wolves and face the shepherd, who was the most ravenous wolf of all. He blew out his lantern, plunging the quarry back into absolute darkness. But for the first time, it wasn't the shadows he was afraid of. It was the man who hid in the light. Returning to Havenwood Hollow from the quarry was like entering a different world. Sheriff Brody rode through the silent, snow-dusted streets, the weight of his discovery a physical burden. The town was asleep, tucked away in their homes, believing their monster had fled. They had no idea the real monster was sleeping soundly in the rectory beside the church, a Bible on his nightstand and the blood of two men on his hands. Brody knew he couldn't just march in and arrest the Reverend. Miller had the town in the palm of his hand. They saw him as their spiritual protector. A direct accusation without overwhelming, irrefutable proof would be seen as blasphemy. They would turn on Brody, not on their preacher. He had the bodies, but he would need help exhuming them, and he couldn't trust his own deputy. He needed to be clever. He needed to use the town's own fear, the very weapon Miller had wielded so effectively against him. His plan began to form as the first gray light of dawn touched the sky. It was Sunday. The entire town would be gathered in one place in Miller's church, listening to his words. It was the perfect stage for the final act. He first went to Thomas Vance. He found the blacksmith in his forge, not working, just sitting on an anvil, staring into the cold, dead hearth, a man hollowed out by grief. "Thomas," Brody said, his voice gentle, "I think I know what happened to Elara." The blacksmith looked up, his eyes empty at first, then flickering with a desperate, dangerous spark. "Is she—" "I don't know if she's alive," Brody said honestly, the words tasting like ash. "But I know who took her, and I need your help to bring him to justice." He told Thomas everything. The journal, the quarry, the bodies, his suspicion of Reverend Miller. He watched as the blacksmith's grief morphed, hardening into a cold, focused rage. The hands that could bend iron into shape clenched into fists. For the first time in weeks, the fire was back in Thomas Vance's eyes. "What do you need me to do?" he asked, his voice a low growl. "I need you to come to church," Brody said. "And I need you to trust me." Next, Brody went to see Mayor Thompson. He found the mayor much as he had left him, drunk and terrified. Brody didn't mince words. "I know about the quarry, Mayor. I know what Miller did. And I know you've been letting him pull the strings because you're terrified he'll expose your secret about your brother." Thompson collapsed into a chair, his face ashen. "I didn't know what he was going to do. He came to me after the festival. Said the girl was a menace, that she'd found something at the quarry. He said he would take care of it. He told me to keep my mouth shut about everything, or he'd tell the whole world I was a fratricide. I was afraid. He used your secret to make you an accomplice to his," Brody said, his voice cold. "Now you have a choice. You can continue to be his puppet and hang with him when this is over. Or you can help me." The mayor, weeping, agreed. The church bell began to toll, calling the faithful of Havenwood Hollow to service. They filed in, their faces grim and pious, their hearts full of the fear that Miller had so carefully cultivated. They settled into the hard wooden pews, a congregation united in their shared delusion. Thomas Vance sat in the front row, his massive shoulders rigid, his eyes fixed on the pulpit. Mayor Thompson sat with the town council, his hands trembling visibly. Reverend Miller strode to the pulpit, his face a mask of serene authority. He looked out over his flock, his gaze sweeping across their faces. He was at the height of his power, the moral and spiritual shepherd of a town he had successfully terrified into submission. He began his sermon. It was his masterpiece of manipulation. He spoke of the great trial they had endured. He praised their faith for casting out the darkness. He spoke of the fleeing of the guilty, a clear reference to Arthur Finch, calling it a sign of God's judgment. "The shadows have receded," he declared, his voice ringing with triumph. "The unnatural whisper has been silenced. Our town is clean again. We have been sanctified by this trial." It was then that Sheriff Brody stepped out from the vestry at the side of the altar. He was not in his Sunday best. He was in his dusty, travel-worn clothes, his face grim. He walked to the center of the church, standing just below the pulpit, and turned to face the congregation. Gasps rippled through the pews. "I'm afraid you're mistaken, Reverend," Brody said, his voice calm but carrying to every corner of the silent church. "The shadows haven't receded. You just taught everyone to look in the wrong direction." Miller's face tightened, a flicker of anger in his eyes. "Sheriff, this is the house of God. Whatever official business you have can wait." This asterisk is asterisk God's business, Reverend, Brody shot back. It's about the sin of murder. He held up Arthur Finch's journal. I have here the last words of a man you all condemned as a devil, Arthur Finch. He didn't flee. He was murdered. I found his body yesterday and buried in a shallow grave at the old quarry. A collective gasp, a wave of shock and horror, swept through the congregation. They looked from Brody to the Reverend, their certainty beginning to crumble. "This is an outrage," Miller boomed, his voice losing its serene quality, replaced by a hard, angry edge. "You dare to desecrate this holy place with such wild accusations." "I also found another body in that grave," Brody continued, his voice rising, ignoring the preacher. "A stranger. A peddler who passed through town about 2 weeks ago. Some of you may have bought goods from him. His name was John Peters." Brody's eyes locked onto Miller's. "Finch's journal tells me that Elara Vance saw something at that quarry. A screaming shadow. The shadow of a fresh murder," she told Mr. Finch. "That the stones remember the fall, and they remember the shovel." The church was dead silent. The only sound was the sharp, ragged breathing of the people in the pews. Brody took a step closer to the pulpit. "Tell us, Reverend. Mr. Peters was known to carry a great deal of cash. Was his money worth more than his life? Did he put up a fight? Is that when he fell?" Miller's face was now a mask of pure fury. "Lies. The ravings of a madman and the words of a witch child. You have no proof." "Oh, but I do," Brody said, turning his head slightly. "Mayor Thompson, why don't you tell the good people of Havenwood Hollow what Reverend Miller said to you the night Elara disappeared? Tell them how he used a 20-year-old secret to blackmail you into silence." All eyes swiveled to the mayor. Thompson was pale and sweating, but he met their gaze. He stood up, his voice shaking. "It's true. All of it. He threatened me. He said he was taking care of a problem that the girl had uncovered." Miller's composure finally shattered. He pointed a trembling finger at the mayor. "Traitor! Liar!" He then turned his venom on Brody. "You will not destroy me. This town believes in me. I am their salvation." "No, Reverend," a deep voice rumbled from the front pew. Thomas Vance stood up, turning to face the congregation. He was a giant of a man, and his grief and rage filled the space around him. "You are not our salvation. You are our sickness. You took my daughter. I cleansed this town of her," Miller shrieked, his piety stripped away, revealing the monster beneath. "She was an abomination. She saw things she wasn't meant to see. She saw what I did at the quarry. She would have ruined everything." It was a full confession, screamed in the house of God. The town stared horrified as the man they had trusted, the man who had guided their fear, revealed himself to be the source of it all. The confession broke the spell. The men of the town surged forward, their faces contorted with rage at having been so completely fooled. They were about to drag Miller from the pulpit when Sheriff Brody fired his pistol into the ceiling. The deafening crack echoed through the church, freezing everyone in place. "He will face the law," Brody commanded. "Not a mob. We are done with mobs in this town." As Brody and his deputy, now wide-eyed and ashamed, clamped irons on the wrists of the sputtering, defeated Reverend, a single question hung in the air, a question that Thomas Vance finally asked, his voice breaking with the agony of a father's last, desperate hope. "Where is she?" he choked out, grabbing the front of Miller's shirt. "What did you do with my little girl?" The Reverend looked at him, and for the first time, a small, cruel smile touched his lips. "I didn't kill her," he said, his voice a venomous whisper. "I did something far worse. I took her to a place where she could speak to shadows for eternity. He described it then, how he'd taken Elara not to the quarry but to the old abandoned iron mine on the far side of the mountain. A place the townsfolk had avoided for 50 years, a labyrinth of collapsing tunnels and deep, flooded shafts. A place of absolute, permanent darkness. He had taken her deep inside, into a section of the mine known for its instability, and he had left her there. Then he'd used dynamite from the quarry to seal the entrance, burying her alive. "She's gone," Miller hissed as they dragged him away. Food for the rocks, and the darkness she loved so much. A collective wail of despair rose from the congregation. The truth was more monstrous than any of their superstitions. Elara hadn't been taken by shadows. She had been condemned to them by the man who preached about the light. The aftermath of Reverend Miller's confession was not the relief of a solved case, but the sickening, hollow echo of a tragedy that could never be undone. The town of Havenwood Hollow awoke from its fever dream of witches and demonic whispers to face a far more mundane and brutal reality. They had been manipulated, their fears weaponized, and their silence had condemned an innocent child. A group of men led by Thomas Vance and Sheriff Brody rode immediately to the old iron mine. The sight that greeted them confirmed Miller's story. The entrance, once a dark maw in the side of the mountain, was now completely buried under a mountain of freshly blasted rock and earth. It was an impassable, monolithic tombstone. They tried to dig. For days, the men of Havenwood Hollow, their faces grim with a guilt that went bone deep, worked with shovels and pickaxes. Thomas Vance worked the hardest, his blacksmith's muscles straining, his hands bleeding, his face a mask of determined agony. He was not just trying to recover his daughter. He was trying to claw his way back through his own failure to protect her. But the task was impossible. The blast had been too powerful, the rockfall too immense. After a week of relentless, heartbreaking labor, they had barely made a dent. The mountain held its secret fast. They were forced to accept the horrific truth. Elara Vance was gone, buried alive in the absolute silent darkness beneath their feet. Thomas Vance erected a simple wooden cross at the site of the collapsed mine entrance. He carved her name into it, and the date she disappeared. He didn't carve a date of death. In his heart, some small, irrational part of him refused to believe she was truly gone. He would visit the site every day, sitting for hours just listening, as if he hoped to hear a whisper on the wind. Havenwood Hollow was irrevocably changed. The secrets that Elara had unearthed remained exposed, and the community could not simply stitch itself back together. The baker and his wife eventually separated. The farmer with the moved boundary stone was mired in a legal battle with his neighbor. Mayor Thompson, shamed and broken, resigned his position and became a recluse in his own home. The town's carefully constructed facade of piety and order had been shattered, revealing the rot beneath. The church on the hill stood empty. No one could bring themselves to worship in the place where they had been so thoroughly deceived, where they had allowed themselves to be accomplice to a monstrous plan. The building began to fall into disrepair, its white paint peeling, its windows gathering dust, a silent monument to a faith that had failed them. And what of the shadows? They did not recede as Miller had promised. In a way, they grew even longer. But they were different now. They were no longer a source of supernatural terror. Instead, they became a source of profound, collective sadness. When a person saw a long shadow stretch across the street, they didn't see a monster. They saw a reminder of the little girl they had failed. They saw a reflection of the darkness within their own hearts, the secrets they kept, the fears they allowed to rule them. The shadows became the town's conscience. Stories began to be told, as they always are. Not of the witch child anymore, but of the whispering child, a kind of local saint of the lost and the unseen. Some claimed that on quiet nights, if you stood near the collapsed mine, you could still hear her, not a scream for help, but a soft, gentle whispering, as if she were finally at peace, conversing with the old deep shadows of the earth. Travelers passing through would say that Havenwood Hollow was the quietest, saddest town they had ever seen. A town that seemed to be perpetually holding its breath, listening for something it knew it would never hear again. The story of Elara Vance is a stark reminder that the greatest monsters are not the ones that hide in the dark. They are the ones who stand in the light, who use our own fears against us, and who convince us that the darkness is everywhere except within themselves. She was a little girl who claimed the shadows told her secrets, but in the end, her greatest and most terrible secret was the one she revealed about the people of Havenwood Hollow, that their fear of the shadows was nothing compared to the darkness they carried inside their own hearts all along. When she disappeared, the shadows didn't just grow longer. They simply took the shape of the truth that had been there all along. The world is full of forgotten places like Havenwood Hollow, filled with stories that have been buried by time, just waiting for someone to listen. If you're drawn to these hidden histories, these sanctified secrets that lie just beneath the surface of what we think we know, consider subscribing to our channel. Join us as we continue to explore the mysteries that linger in the shadows of the past. Click the like button if Elara's story touched you, and perhaps we can keep her memory and the memories of so many others like her from fading completely into the dark.